Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be learning about the next type of plant tissue. So in the previous video we've learned about the first type of plant tissue, which are the meristematic tissues, and under that we've learned about the apical meristem and the lateral meristem and the intercalary meristem. So in this video we're going to be concentrating on the permanent tissues. And actually, with regard to the permanent tissues, there are two categories under this as well. So we're going to be learning about the first type of permanent tissue, which is called the simple permanent tissue. So you might wonder why this is called the simple permanent tissue. Why the word simple? So it's called this because if you consider these tissues all, the entire tissue has only one type of cell. The entire tissue is made up of the same type of cell. And in contrast to the simple permanent tissue, the other category is called the complex permanent tissues. It's called complex because these types of tissues have many types of cells within the tissue. So in this video, we're going to be concentrating on the simple permanent tissues. And when we talk about the simple permanent tissues, there are actually three types of simple permanent tissues in our syllabus: the parenchyma, the collenchyma, and the sclerenchyma tissue. All right. So let me just write that down here. There are actually three types of simple permanent tissue that we're going to be discussing about. We're going to be learning about the parenchyma tissue, and then about the collenchyma tissue, and then finally about the sclerenchyma tissue. All right, so let's start with our first simple permanent tissue, about the parenchyma tissue. All right, so when you look at this tissue, now you know that a tissue is a group of cells, right? And here are a group of cells. All these cells are parenchyma cells, and you can see the entire tissue is made up of just one type of cell. You see the same cell in the entire tissue, and that's why it's called a simple permanent tissue. So let's take a look at this parenchyma tissue and see what the important features are. So the first thing is about the shape of these cells. When you look at these parenchyma cells, you can see that they are isodiametric or spherical cells. You see the shape of these cells, they are roughly spherical in shape. All right. And the second thing you notice is if you look at their cell wall, you see their cell wall over here, they have a thin cell wall. They all have thin cell walls. And you can see a nucleus in all of these cells. And the fact that these cells have a nucleus means that they are all living cells. And finally, if you look at the space between the cells, just look at these cells over here, like this one and this one and this one, you can clearly see that there are spaces between the cells. So we say that in the parenchyma tissue, intercellular spaces are present. So if ever at your exam you get a tissue like this, where you see these cells with thin cell walls, and where there are intercellular spaces between the cells, if you ever get a diagram like this, this is the parenchyma tissue. So the identifying factors are the thin cell walls and the spaces between the cells, which are called the intercellular spaces. All right, so yes, a diagram like this, you should be able to identify this as a parenchyma tissue, okay? How do you identify this as the parenchyma tissue? By the thin cell walls and also by the presence of the intercellular spaces. All right, so that's about the parenchyma tissue. And next we are moving on to the second type of simple permanent tissue, which is the collenchyma tissue. Now, again, I want you all to note how if you look at the collenchyma tissue, in this particular diagram, you see 4 cells, right? And all of these 4 cells are the same type of cell. And that is why we call this a simple permanent tissue. All right. So let's focus on the features of this collenchyma tissue. If you consider this collenchyma tissue, these cells also have a nucleus. So these cells also contain a nucleus. So that means that these cells are definitely living cells. And if you look at these collenchyma cells, the most unique feature about them is their cell walls. Now, if you look at their cell walls, they have cell walls which are thickened. They have cell walls in which the corners are thickened. So this is the most unique feature of the collenchyma tissue and the most easy feature that helps us to identify the collenchyma tissue. So what this means is, now if you take a look at these cells, now usually if you take a normal plant cell, the cell wall has a uniform thickness throughout the cell, right? You can see that the cell wall has a uniform thickness. But for collenchyma, this is not the case. If you take a collenchyma cell, this is what the cell wall of a collenchyma cell looks like. What do you see over here? You can see that when the cell walls come to the corner, they have become thickened in the corners. So the corners of the cell walls are thickened. So thickened corners, this is the most unique feature of the collenchyma tissue that helps you to identify this. So if you ever get a diagram of just cells like this, okay, also I didn't mention that these are polygon shaped cells, right? So the shape of these cells are polygonal shape. So if you ever get a diagram with polygonal shaped cells, where the corners of the cell walls are thickened. If you ever get a diagram similar to this, you should be able to identify this as a collenchyma tissue. How do you identify this? By the unique feature of having thickened cell walls. So that is how you identify a collenchyma tissue. All right. And then that brings us to the third type of simple permanent tissue, which are the sclerenchyma tissue. Now, sclerenchyma is very different to parenchyma and collenchyma. When you look at this sclerenchyma tissue, you can see that you see the same type of cell everywhere around this tissue, and that is why it falls under simple permanent tissue. But the unique features of this sclerenchyma tissue is that all these cells are dead cells. Now, if you take a look at these cells, you don't see anything inside these cells, right? There's no nucleus, there's no cytoplasm, there's basically nothing inside the cell. It's a hollow space inside the cell. So these are all dead cells. And the next unique feature of this sclerenchyma tissue is the thickness of the cell walls. The cell walls are thick. So they have thick cell walls. They have thick cell walls where lignin has been deposited on the cellulose cell wall. All right. So if you ever see a diagram like this, where the cells are having thick cell walls with nothing inside it, that's probably going to be a sclerenchyma tissue. All right. So these are the identifying factors. They are dead cells with nothing inside, and they have pretty thick cell walls. Why are they thick? Because there's this additional substance called lignin that has come into these cell walls. Now, lignin is a very strong substance, and because the sclerenchyma tissue has lignin, it makes the sclerenchyma tissue strong, and that is why the primary function of sclerenchyma tissue is to provide support. Now, what are the other features in addition to these? You can see through this picture over here, you can see how the cells are tightly packed. They are tightly packed, And do you see any intercellular spaces? No, right? So there are no intercellular spaces. All right. And finally, um, inside the cells, you see a lumen, an empty hollow space. So these are the features of the sclerenchyma tissue, and this is how you identify a sclerenchyma tissue, by noticing that it is a dead cell with nothing inside and having a thick cell wall. All right, so that's what you need to know about the simple permanent tissues. We've gone through the parenchyma, the collenchyma, and the sclerenchyma tissue. Just to give you all a little more information, the parenchyma tissue is the most abundant tissue in the whole plant. It is found in many different locations of the plant. It's found in the plant stem, in the cortex and pith of the plant stem, and it's also found. Yes, I'm just going to write that down here in a different color. It's found in the cortex and pith of the stem. And also it's found in the cortex and pith of the root. And also you find a lot of parenchyma cells in the leaves of the plant. And these parenchyma tissue in the leaves, they help the leaves to carry out photosynthesis. All right, then moving on to the collenchyma tissue, a few extra points you need to know is that the collenchyma tissue actually has, it's there in different locations. For example, it's there inner to the epidermis of herbaceous stems. So let me just note that down. It is found inner to the epidermis in herbaceous stems. And in addition to that, it is also found in the veins of leaves. So all of you all have seen the veins of leaves, right? The veins that run across the leaves. So that contains collenchyma tissue. And the function of collenchyma tissue, the main function is to provide support. And in addition to that, it also does photosynthesis in some cases. All right, so I hope all of you got a good understanding on these three simple permanent tissues. That's all regarding this.